Welcome back to another AP World History video lecture. This time we're going to be taking a look at reactions to the Industrial Revolution. Now please remember, in the 1700s we have an Industrial Revolution. It's going to be followed up by a second Industrial Revolution. How do we distinguish between the two? Well, it has to do with energy and the use of new types of energy in order to create mass production. In the 1700s in Britain, coal is discovered, and it's found out that if you use coal, you can heat up fire. Fire can be used to create steam, and steam can be condensed and move things. In the 1800s, they're going to find a much quicker way to do this, and that is the use of electricity. So it's really important to see that. Coal in the 1700s, electricity in the 1800s. So what are the positives that come out of this? There are a ton of positives. A new middle class arises to challenge the upper class aristocracy that were landowners. So this is sort of the end to feudalism. We move away from feudalism and the cottage system into the Industrial Revolution and the factory system. However, there are a ton of negatives. Remember, poor farmers and peasants and serfs were kicked off of lands in the enclosure movement, and they moved into urban centers. Now there, they did see an improvement in their lives overall, but they still saw overall poor wages, poor working conditions, child labor as early as the age of 8 years old, having to go out and work in places like the coal mines, congestion in urban areas. Now at the time, the governmental philosophy was one called laissez-faire, or the idea that the government should not get involved, let the marketplace solve these problems. And it comes from a major thinker named Adam Smith. We're going to talk about him in just a few minutes. Please remember that Adam Smith was not challenging what we think today, socialism. He was challenging mercantilism, the idea that the national economy was what was most important. Adam Smith said, actually, it's the individuals competing against each other that were most important. So, what's going to be the major argument here? The reactions that arose to this challenge challenged the social and economic hierarchies at the time and asked, what was the role of the state or the government in solving these problems? Okay, let's go over the different reactions. Reaction number one, you might remember, was laissez-faire, and that was developed by this man named Adam Smith. In 1776, what was our biggest revolution in the world? Yeah, I know you're thinking American Revolution, but actually I would argue that there's another one going on. This old man out in Scotland sits down and he writes or pens a pamphlet called The Wealth of Nations. And in it, he challenges mercantilism. He says, you know, the government or the state is using all these tariffs and taxes to keep individuals from competing and innovating. We got to get rid of that. Allow the individual to compete. And if you do that, then the nation will prosper. It's led to the analogy that he used called the invisible hand. The idea that if you allow people to compete against each other, competition itself will lead to lower costs, lower prices, and more jobs and more innovation. Now that was sort of the positive end. On the more negative end, in the 1850s, another guy came along, and his name was Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer would take Adam Smith's ideas and mix them with Charles Darwin's ideas of evolution and come up with something called social Darwinism. Herbert Spencer argued that the competition of winners was not really based upon talents and skills, but rather based upon biology, today what we would call genetic inheritances. Herbert Spencer basically argued that the poor were the poor because that was the way they were meant to be by nature. And if we got in the way of that, then all we would end up doing is stagnating those who were meant to be of the elite. So he argued that really there was a need for no intervention. Just allow nature to take its course. Over time, the people who are biologically inferior would just wither away and die. This led to this idea of social Darwinism and then eventually scientific racism. Okay, second reaction, a more what we would call today moderate reaction, which comes from what was known as the Union movement. There are unions across the world at this time period. In England, there was the Labour Party, and they argued for fixing the Industrial Revolution, or fixing what today we call capitalism, and allowing for a slow, peaceful transition to what is known as a social democracy. Okay, what's a social democracy? That's where the government gets involved in order to fix parts of capitalism that don't seem to work all that well. So like, for example, to offer a minimum wage, offer maximum working hours, regulations on working conditions, and the end to child labor. They use what's called collective bargaining, meaning you get a whole bunch of workers together and they basically threaten the owner with a strike or a protest that would stop production. Production is what makes profits for the owner, so if they don't fix things up, they don't really want their workers to be going out on strike. Eventually, this did lead to some legislation that got passed. One of the biggest examples of that was the Factory Act of 1833 in Great Britain, and that made education mandatory for all children between the ages of 5 to 10. Now, there were a group of people who were on more of the radical end who said, the union movement has it right that we need better protections for workers. They just have it wrong about the end goal or how we get there. And that's reaction number 3, which is socialism. Socialism was the belief that we should move away from this idea of individual private property. Rather, have the government be the owner of property in general. Now, when I say the government being the owner, I don't mean that the government itself is the owner. I mean we, the people, are represented by a government that owns property in common and would make sure it was used for the benefit of people in common. Now, initially, socialism really got started off with model societies. A good example of this is Robert Owen. He established a factory system that was owned by the workers, and he facilitated that ownership, and they would share in their profits. They established a 10-hour workday. I know that probably sounds like a lot today, right? Because today we have like an 8 or 9-hour workday, at least by law. But back at that time period, people worked anywhere from 17 to 19 hours a day. So they established this 10-hour workday, safe working conditions, an end to child labor, an expansion of education, and a promise that all workers would benefit from the growth of profits over time. Okay, reaction number 4, pretty close to the most radical end you can get, is Marxism. Karl Marx was in Prussia, today what is known as Germany. In the 1850s, he argued that everybody had it wrong, that the first place that they had it wrong was understanding how history operated. According to him, history was about conflict. It was about conflict between different groups of people, what he called class conflict. And in his view of history, there were a number of different classes that developed over time, but eventually we got to a period in history, the industrial period, in which we had 2 classes. The bourgeoisie, okay, who are those guys? They're the guys who own the factories, own what he called the mode of production. And then there was the proletariat, the workers who worked inside of the factory system. He argued that eventually factory owners had to try and cut their costs. Why? Because of competition. And the best way to cut costs would eventually be to mechanize labor. We can kind of understand that today. Take a look around. How many people are put out of work because we use machines and robots in order to replace them? Why? The initial cost of buying a machine is pretty hefty, but after that, you don't have to pay a machine hourly, right? You don't have to worry about a machine going to the bathroom. You don't have to worry about a machine needing holidays or time off for family. In other words, machines cut you on costs. But by putting out workers into unemployment, you just keep raising the amount of what he called mass immiseration of all the workers. Plus, I would argue on top of that, that there's an internal contradiction to this. What do I mean by that? The more workers we throw out of labor, the less people there are to buy things. That's the downside of machines. Machines don't buy from you. They only make stuff if they're working. So eventually workers would realize they had only one solution left. As a group, they would come to a consciousness that all of them had the same struggle, this unemployment due to the cutting of costs. They would rise up in a revolution, take over the state and create a new socialist government that would distribute out everything to people equally. And then this is where everybody kind of gets mixed up, because we always think of communism as a horrible thing, right? In reality, we're going to see it did end up being pretty horrible. But at least in Karl Marx's mind, what was supposed to happen was that once everything was spread out to people, money would disappear. Police would disappear. Armies would disappear. Why? Because now everybody had their needs met. And now what they could do every single day was go out and be economically and politically free in a communist utopia society, a society in which you could choose to be what you wanted to be because you no longer had to worry each day about surviving. Okay, next up, reaction number 5, anarchists. So the anarchists are best known. There are 2 of them, 2 big ones. There are a lot of thinkers. The English thinker William Godwin, and then there's also the Russian Peter Kropotkin, and they agreed with Marxists that there was a major problem with industrial leaders, but they also believed that the government was a problem as well. In fact, they argued the main problem was just centralized power in total. And they said, in the 1700s, 1800s, the problem was we had moved into these huge nations in which governments and industrial powers were robbing people of their local power. So they criticized both the monarchy and the factory system, and they weren't all that happy with the idea of moving to communism either. They wanted to return to farming, what they called anarcho-syndicalist societies. What are these? They're small farming communities in which people would make decisions as a group in local democracies. A good way to picture this would be like a town hall meeting. Imagine everybody in a local town hall area coming to a church and just voting all together on what was best. And since everybody had a say, there really wouldn't be a need for police or centralized authority. Okay, last up, the Luddites. The Luddites were largely middle-ranking and well-skilled craftsmen, and they saw their jobs being destroyed by this new machinery run by coal and steam. Now, initially what they tried to do is they tried to negotiate with factory owners over this to keep their jobs, but factory owners liked the fact that these new machines mass-produced and cut costs for them. So they started realizing, these Luddites, that the factory machinery ended up replacing them, or you just needed low-skilled labor to come in and just sort of like clean up around the factories. You really didn't need any high-skilled labor anymore. So they turned to destroying some of these factory machines like the water looms and the weaves. Eventually, they themselves would be destroyed by local armies and police. So what are our big takeaways here? Please remember that industrialization did bring massive progress to people in living standards and social mobility. But it also created a number of problems that needed to be resolved. Massive inequalities, monopolization by different companies. There was also a question of the relationship of machines to labor. And so in reaction to this, we have a number of new movements that arise. The reactions included the defense of industrial competition by people like Adam Smith and laissez-faire capitalism. Eventually that morphed into a much more dangerous or dark side with social Darwinism. We also saw arguments made about the need to just tinker around and fix capitalism, like that with unions. But then we saw the radical ideas. Was it possible to create a world based upon equality? Was it possible to be creating a world based upon a new way of looking at things, not through the individual, but through a collective joint effort together to create better wages and better working conditions? Okay, see you in class.